Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when comfort meant surviving the night without frostbite, and the word camping didn't mean roasting marshmallows, it meant not dying of exposure. You're in the Middle Ages now. The air smells of wet earth and smoke, and every breath feels like it carries a lesson carved by hardship. You're standing outside a thatched hut where someone's managed to coax a thread of smoke into the darkening sky, proof that fire, fragile and temperamental, is life itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first rule of medieval survival: you need fire and fast, but it's raining. The wood's wet, your hands are shaking, and your matches, well, they don't exist yet. Fire isn't a convenience, it's a miracle. You'd have to earn it one spark at a time. You kneel by a patch of soggy moss, clutching a small pouch that every peasant, traveler, and soldier knew to carry, the fire-striking kit. Inside there's a shard of flint, a lump of iron called a fire steel, and a bit of soft, charred cloth. You crouch close to the ground, shielding the tinder from the wind with your body. The rhythm of flint against steel becomes hypnotic, tink, 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 until finally one golden spark lands and clings to the blackened cloth. You blow gently, like you're coaxing a sleeping mouse awake. The ember glows, breathing with you, and suddenly there it is, the faint crackle of birth. It's humbling to realize that medieval people could start a fire faster than most of us can open a lighter. They didn't need butane or fancy gadgets. They had patience, practice, and the understanding that nature's smallest gifts, stone, cloth, breath, could create warmth and light. Some used fungus instead of cloth. Tinder fungus, they called it, an odd-looking growth pried from birch trees and carefully dried. If you've ever seen it, you'd think it couldn't possibly burn. But once prepared with saltpeter and pounded into softness, it could catch even the smallest spark. Historians still argue whether this method came from Norse travelers or even further east, from Silk Road merchants who carried survival tricks along with their spices. And here's a secret most modern campers miss. It wasn't just about lighting fire, it was about keeping it. If you were traveling for days, you'd guard your flame like a living creature. People carried embers wrapped in moss, tucked into hollowed animal horns, or hidden inside clay pots with air holes. One glowing coal could sleep through the night and wake again in the morning, saving precious effort. It's easy to forget, but medieval people were basically walking firebanks. You shift your weight closer to the blaze. The smoke clings to your clothes, your eyes sting a little, but you don't care. You've done what thousands before you did, turned spark into survival. The villagers nearby would have gathered around too. Fire wasn't private, it was communal. It warmed bodies, dried boots, and roasted whatever you'd managed to catch. Sometimes in monasteries or isolated hamlets, a keeper of the flame was appointed, a person whose job was to ensure that the hearth never went dark. In an age when relighting meant real risk, that duty was sacred. There are records from Northern Europe of church hearths that burned continuously for decades, tended by generations. You can almost imagine a sleepy monk, eyes drooping, stirring the embers through midnight silence while snow whispered outside. Of course, not all fires were friendly. Villages knew how to read smoke like language. Light blue smoke meant wet fuel. Black, choking smoke meant danger, perhaps a roof or barn ablaze. They'd rush water from wells in leather buckets, shouting to the bell tower for help. Fire was survival, but it was also threat, a double-edged warmth. You notice the irony. You're warmer now, but your throat's dry. Fire makes you crave water, which in medieval times wasn't exactly safe to drink. But that's for later. For now, you stare into the flickering light and realize something subtle. The people who lived this way weren't primitive. They were practiced. Think of it this way: they could make warmth from stone, light from breath, comfort from ash. Could you? There's one more odd technique worth noting. If the weather was too cruel and even tinder wouldn't catch, some travelers used gunpowder dust, after it appeared in Europe in the late Middle Ages, to ignite a stubborn pile of sticks. Dangerous, absolutely, but desperate times, as they say. So you sit there, the rain easing off, watching the fire climb and dance. The smoke curls into the mist, and you realize that every medieval person who ever lived shared this same sight: orange against black, the color of hope. And as the embers settle, you understand why ancient people treated fire as sacred, not just as a tool, but as proof that life could still glow in the dark. The secret of the cloak: learn why that simple wool cloak wasn't just clothing, but an entire survival toolkit against cold, rain, and even hunger violent. In a world without uniforms or badges, fabric spoke louder than words. If you approached the wrong village in the wrong season, say after a raid or a poor harvest, one mistaken gesture could make you look like a threat. A pinned cloak might say, "I'm no danger, just cold." A hooded, shadowed face could say, "Keep your distance." People read each other through wool and instinct. And beyond its language and warmth, that cloak was your armor. Not in the shining metal sense, but in the practical one. A good wool cloak could soften a blow, deflect a glancing blade, or in desperate moments serve as a makeshift shield. There's a tale from 12th century Wales about a shepherd ambushed by bandits who wrapped his thick cloak around one arm and used it to catch a knife strike. He survived, bruised and bleeding but alive, crediting his woolen guardian. It sounds like a folk tale, yet archaeologists have actually found cloaks woven so densely they could resist light cuts. Then there's the cloak's strangest secret: it could feed you. In lean months, people used to boil scraps of old, unwashed wool in water to skim off the lanolin fat, mixing it with herbs and barley to make a greasy, barely edible broth. It wasn't exactly fine dining, think sheep-flavored soup, but it could stave off starvation. You wouldn't survive long on it, but sometimes long enough mattered. When rain lashed the countryside, the cloak transformed again. It became your roof. You drape it over a stick or the branch of a hedge, pin down the corners with stones and curl up beneath. Shepherds called this a abaya cloak, part tent, part cocoon. And if you had to travel in sleet or fog, the damp will even muffled sound. Letting you move quietly, a trick used by scouts and thieves alike. It's easy to imagine the quiet comfort it offered. Picture yourself lying beneath that coarse fabric, the edges pulled tight against your cheeks. You can hear the faint hiss of rain hitting wool, smell the earthy mix of smoke and lanolin, and feel the slow warmth of your own breath gathering beneath the folds. There's safety in that stillness, the kind that comes only when you know you've made your own shelter from nothing but nature. In monasteries, the cloak took on new meaning. Monks called theirs cuculars, voluminous cowls that reached the ground and symbolized humility. But practically speaking, they were perfect insulation in cold, stone abbeys where the morning air bit through even faith itself. Monks often slept in them, heads covered, fingers tucked away. It blurred the line between clothing and dwelling, turning fabric into fortress. And if you were lucky enough to own more than one cloak, you could layer them, an early version of modern insulation systems. Outer layers for rain, inner ones for warmth. Travelers on long journeys sometimes reversed their cloaks daily, letting the damp side dry against the sun while the fresh side faced inward. Historians still debate where this layering culture began. Some point to Norse traders, others to the Celts, but all agree on one thing: without the cloak, half of medieval Europe would have frozen before spring. Even the wealthy, surrounded by tapestries and fires, kept cloaks handy. A fur-lined one wasn't just luxury, it was a status symbol and survival tool. The cloaks of knights were sometimes dyed black on one side and white on the other, so they could switch them depending on the terrain, a trick blending practicality with stealth. And then there were pilgrim cloaks. Each had a badge stitched near the chest, a scallop shell for Santiago, a cross for Jerusalem. It wasn't decoration, it was your passport. Inns and churches recognized the badge and offered you shelter or food. The cloak itself told your story, where you'd been, who you prayed to, how far you'd walked. You notice now that the fabric brushing against your hands feels alive, as if it remembers the warmth of those before you. Each thread whispers survival. You can almost hear the muttered prayers of shepherds huddled on wind-blown hillsides, the laughter of children wrapped against the cold, the quiet snore of a monk beneath a stone arch. And as you pull the cloak tighter, you start to understand. Survival wasn't about strength or tools or luck. It was about adaptation, about knowing how to turn what you had into what you needed. So tonight, if your blanket feels thin or your room a bit chilly, remember, you're still luckier than the medieval wanderer, crouched beneath his woolen roof, whispering thanks to the rain that didn't soak through. Hidden water, hidden wells explore the ingenious ways people found clean drinking water without maps, pumps, or modern filters. Morning arrives grey and cold. The embers of last night's fire have gone dull, and the mist hangs thick enough to taste. You draw that same cloak closer as your throat prickles with thirst. In a world without plumbing, plastic bottles, or clean taps, water was both a blessing and a gamble. Finding it, and keeping it safe to drink, was one of the most important medieval survival arts. You walk through a field still beaded with dew, and every step squelches softly in the mud. You'd think with all this moisture, thirst wouldn't be a problem. But back then, the challenge wasn't finding water, it was finding water that wouldn't kill you. Streams shimmered invitingly, but they also carried waste, animal droppings, and sometimes corpses. Wells could turn foul after a single dead rat fell in. And yet somehow people managed to survive centuries without filters or chlorine. How? Through observation, instinct, and a little clever trickery. You spot a low dip in the ground, thick with reeds. A medieval traveler would know what that meant, groundwater near the surface. Villagers often followed plant life like a map. Willows, reeds, and certain mosses marked the secret veins of water running below. When desperate, they'd dig shallow pits there and wait for the seep. The first water to rise might be cloudy, but beneath it flowed a cleaner layer, naturally filtered through soil. Medieval texts described listening for water. That wasn't poetic, it was literal. People would press their ears to the ground or to wooden rods to hear faint trickles underground. It sounds strange, but in quiet countryside, you actually can detect the soft burble of moving water beneath layers of earth. Of course, there were more mystical approaches too. Enter the dowser, a person who claimed they could find hidden wells using a forked stick or a bent metal rod. You've probably seen the image, arms outstretched, eyes half closed, the rod twitching as they walked. Today, we'd call it pseudoscience, but for many medieval villagers, it was the closest thing to a miracle worker. Some priests even blessed the rods before use. Historians still argue whether these water witches had any real skill, or if they were simply reading the landscape better than most. When water was found, protecting it was sacred duty. Wells were lined with stone, covered with heavy lids, and sometimes even blessed by the local priest to keep demons from fouling it. The church understood what germs couldn't yet explain. Unguarded water meant disease. In towns where space was tight and waste flowed freely, people got creative. They collected rainwater in barrels and cisterns, sometimes filtering it through layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it worked surprisingly well. You can picture it now. A woman catching the first clean rain after weeks of drought, laughing as she fills her jug, knowing that this barrel could mean the difference between sickness and survival. And for those constantly on the move, soldiers, traders, pilgrims, there were other tricks. They'd boil water over small fires though wood was precious, or mix it with weak ale, turning it into something safer to drink. This small beer had low alcohol content but enough acidity to kill bacteria. Children drank it, monks brewed it, and travelers relied on it. In some regions, even water for washing vegetables was laced with a little ale or vinegar, just in case. If you couldn't boil or brew, you improvised. Medieval wanderers were masters of filtration. They'd pour muddy water through folded linen, moss, or even crushed reeds to strain out grit and insects. One 13th century survival manual suggested adding a few hot stones to a jug of water. Heat and steam would purify it, though probably just warmed it enough to taste less swampy. In arid lands like Spain or southern Italy, water scarcity bred genius. Peasants learned to build underground cisterns that stayed cool and clean for months. Lined with lime plaster to keep out rot. In the mountains, people trapped dew on cloths stretched overnight, wringing them out in the morning. Desert monks even used ceramic sweating jars, which kept water cool through evaporation. You kneel beside a medieval-style well, wooden bucket creaking as it lowers into the dark. The echo of the rope and the slow splash below feel ancient, almost sacred. When you haul the bucket up, droplets gleam on its rim like tiny mirrors. You take a sip, and it tastes faintly of minerals and earth, a reminder that pure doesn't always mean pleasant. There's a small superstition that might make you smile. Some villagers believed the first sip from a fresh well should always go to the spirits of the earth. Pouring a few drops back into the hole was a gesture of respect, a way of saying thank you to the unseen forces that allowed life to flow. Maybe it wasn't science, but it was gratitude in its purest form. And then there were travelers' secrets, those little survival hacks passed from mouth to ear. Like this one, always drink upstream from where animals do. Or another, if the water runs clear over smooth stones, it's safer than stagnant pools, no matter how inviting they look. People learned these rules not from books, but from watching what killed their neighbors. In plague years, fear of bad water grew so strong that entire villages abandoned wells suspected of being cursed. Later generations would rediscover them, clean them, and find nothing wrong, just coincidence and paranoia layered over centuries. But you can't blame them. When you live in a world without microscopes, survival often depends on hunches and habits that feel true. You tilt your head and listen again. The drip of water against stone sounds rhythmic, soothing. You realize how much trust those people placed in their senses. They could smell when water was off, feel when it was too cold or too still, hear when the spring had slowed. It was an intimacy with nature we've mostly lost. Modern life has replaced that instinct with filters and pipes and packaged safety. But somewhere deep down, you can still sense the ancient thrill of finding water where no one else thought to look. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve, glance toward the horizon, and think, the medieval world may have been dirty, dangerous, and unpredictable, but it taught its people one timeless rule: respect what sustains you. Because survival wasn't just about having enough water, it was about understanding its moods, its rhythms, and its fragile generosity. Bread that lasted months, step into smoky kitchens, where peasants baked rock-hard travel loaves, designed to outlive a season of famine. Your thirst fades, but now your stomach growls, low and impatient, like an animal packing in its cage. Food in the medieval world was never a guarantee. In spring you might feast, in winter you might starve. Yet somehow people found ways to stretch their harvest, turning flour, fire, and patience into something miraculous, bread that lasted for months. You might think of warm, fluffy loaves fresh from the oven, but in this world bread was survival, not comfort. Forget soft and golden. Medieval bread was often so hard you'd need a knife or a hammer to break it. The trick wasn't taste, it was longevity. You sit by a simple village oven, shaped like a beehive and blackened with smoke. The baker, a wiry woman with flour-dusted hands, slides out flat, dark rounds of something that looks closer to stone than food. This was called hardtack or journey bread. Soldiers carried it on campaign, sailors stored it in barrels for months, and peasants baked it before the harvest to have something, anything to chew through winter. When baked right, it didn't mold, didn't rot, and barely changed at all. In fact, it was so durable that archaeologists have found 600-year-old pieces still intact. They probably wouldn't recommend eating them, though. The recipe was simple but brutal: coarse rye or barley flour, a little water, and sometimes a pinch of salt. No yeast, no rising, just kneaded into thick slabs and baked low and slow until every drop of moisture was gone. You could store these slabs in cloth sacks or wooden boxes for half a year. To eat one, you'd soak it in broth, milk, or ale until it softened barely. Some travelers joked that one loaf could outlast the baker. But not all long-life bread was punishment. In monasteries and noble kitchens, bakers perfected a more delicate craft. They made panis duras, hard bread, infused with herbs, honey, or dried fruit. The sugar acted as a preservative. Pilgrims to Jerusalem carried such loaves on their journeys, blessing them before departure. A good pilgrim loaf could survive both desert heat and sea salt air. One of the strangest medieval inventions was the trencher. At feasts, people didn't use plates, they used thick slabs of stale bread. The meal's juices soaked into it, and when the feast ended, the trenchers went to the poor or pigs. Nothing wasted, everything useful. Even when food was scarce, bread remained the foundation of life, literally and symbolically. "Give us this day our daily bread" wasn't poetry, it was a plea. Still, hunger was the great equalizer. Peasants had years when crops failed, when grain stores were raided, when war turned fields into mud. That's when survival demanded creativity. They'd stretch flour with whatever they could find: ground acorns, pea flour, even crushed bark. A bitter, gritty bread, but one that filled bellies. Historians call these famine loaves. Some even included clay or powdered chalk to bulk them up, a dangerous gamble, but desperation doesn't weigh risks. In some regions, people used moss and seaweed as filler. In Scandinavia, they mixed birch bark powder into dough, adding fiber and longevity. It sounds inedible, yet modern studies show that birch bark is surprisingly nutritious, full of plant compounds that can stave off scurvy. Maybe the peasants didn't know why it worked, only that it did. And then there was black bread, the poorest grain, the roughest grind, baked till it was dense as stone. It fed serfs, soldiers, and prisoners. The rich, of course, preferred fine white wheat bread manchet, a status symbol as bright as their linens. But over time, the poor man's loaf proved stronger. Coarse breads had more nutrients and fiber, keeping people alive while the delicate white loaves spoiled faster. Survival, as always, belonged to the practical. You imagine biting into one now, crust like rock, flavor of smoke and earth. Not pleasant, but solid. Real, a food that doesn't pamper you, just sustains you. In its simplicity, there's dignity. Every medieval village had a communal oven. Fuel was scarce, so people shared fire. Once a week, you'd see lines of villagers bringing their shaped loaves, marked with symbols so no one took the wrong one. The oven's keeper timed each batch by instinct, feeling heat with an open palm. If the flames licked too high, he'd toss in a handful of damp straw to calm them. Fire, once again, deciding who ate and who starved. There's a beautiful irony here. While nobles dined on pastries, the peasants' hard loaves became the true backbone of civilization. They lasted through famine, war, and plague, passed from mother to daughter with whispered ratios and sacred timing. Sometimes, monks baked bread so hard it was never meant to be eaten immediately. It was made for pilgrims yet to come, stored in cool abbey cellars, waiting months for strangers who might need it. Imagine that, baking bread today for someone hungry next year. A traveler's manual from 14th century Germany advises, break your bread with patience, for haste is the enemy of hunger. You smile at that. Maybe that's the lesson: patience turned flour to fortitude. And even in famine, people made it ritual. A crumb dropped on the floor was kissed before being picked up. Bread wasn't food, it was sacred matter, a line between survival and surrender. Now, as the scent of roasted grain still lingers in your imagination, you understand, the medieval world's greatest secret wasn't luxury, it was endurance. They learned how to make food last longer than hope, and sometimes that was enough. So next time you toss out a stale crust, remember, once upon a time, that crust could have been a week's salvation. Medicines in the hedge wander through medieval hedgerows to uncover forgotten herbal cures that could soothe pain or end it. The fire, the cloak, the water, the bread, all pieces of the same fragile puzzle. Yet even with warmth in your hands and food in your belly, survival in the Middle Ages depended on something else entirely: the skill to fight sickness when it came calling. You couldn't run from disease. You had to know it, learn its habits, its warnings, its ways. Tonight, you wander the hedgerows and gardens where that wisdom once grew, tucked quietly in leaves and roots. the forgotten medicines in the hedge. The air smells faintly of crushed mint and damp earth. Along the narrow path, tiny blossoms lean toward the fading light: yarrow, sage, fennel, and plantain. To the untrained eye, they're weeds, but to a medieval healer, each was a tool sharper than any blade. You reach down, brushing the soft fuzz of comfrey leaves, the so-called bone knit. They used it to bind fractures and heal deep bruises. Boiled into a paste and wrapped in linen, it became a miracle poultice. Knowledge like this wasn't found in dusty books. It was whispered, sung, passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The best healers weren't doctors in grand robes, they were women who knew the woods. They knew when nettles were young and edible, when chamomile soothed stomach pain, and when too much foxglove could still the heart forever. It was science before science had a name. You can almost see her now, the village-wise woman, her hair silvered, hands rough and stained with sap. People came to her door at night, clutching their bellies or carrying feverish children. She'd light a tallow candle, mutter a prayer to Saint Hildegard or the Virgin, and mix potions from jars of dried leaves. Sometimes she charged a coin. Sometimes just a promise: help my family when I'm gone. Some healers worked by moonlight. They believed the moon pulled illnesses from the body just as it pulled tides. Others marked their herbs with prayers before cutting them, because if you offended the plant, the cure might fail. Modern skeptics might laugh, but this quiet ritual gave meaning to medicine in a world of mystery. Historians still argue whether these women were persecuted as witches because of fear or envy. Their skills gave them quiet power. In a time when men of the church prescribed relics and repentance for sickness, hedge healers used what nature offered freely, and more often than not, their patients lived. You spot a sprig of lavender among the weeds. Its smell cuts clean through the damp air, sharp, floral, faintly sweet. Lavender was antiseptic before the word existed. It warded off lice, soothed burns, calmed nerves. Hospitals, yes, real medieval hospitals, were often lined with it, the air heavy with fragrance to cover less pleasant smells. Then there's garlic, the great equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone used it. Soldiers rubbed it on wounds to keep rot away. Housewives crushed it into tonics for cough and plague alike. Garlic was even worn in amulets, little bulbs dangling from children's necks to frighten evil spirits or fleas, which probably worked better. For headaches, people chewed willow bark, the same source of salicin, the compound that eventually became aspirin. Imagine that, a medieval peasant, long before chemistry, easing pain with the same natural ingredient still used in modern pills. Survival often looked like superstition, but underneath it was real, practical wisdom. Some remedies were delightfully odd. To cure toothache, you might burn a toad and sniff the ashes. No, really. For gout, tie a live frog to your foot until it stops moving, then you're healed. Many of these sound absurd now, yet hidden among the nonsense were real insights. The frog trick, for example, may have worked simply because cold amphibian skin numbed pain. They didn't know why it helped, only that it sometimes did. Monasteries, too, were treasure houses of healing. Monks kept herb gardens called physic gardens, with neat rows of sage, thyme, and marigold. They copied manuscripts like the Herbarium Apulii, filled with sketches of plants and their uses. When travelers fell ill, the monastery gates opened, and the monks brewed syrups, poultices, or spiced wines for fever. One chronicler from Canterbury wrote that God's garden was enough for all diseases, if only man learned to read it. Sometimes people mixed magic and medicine without seeing the line between. They'd wrap a written charm in cloth, half prayer, half prescription, and tie it around the wrist. If it worked, credit went to both heaven and herb. You kneel and crush a leaf of mint between your fingers. Its scent is cool, comforting. For a moment, you can almost believe that this patch of earth holds everything you'd ever need to live. Medieval people did. Their pharmacy wasn't a building, it was the world around them. In winter, when plants slept, healers dried and stored their herbs carefully, tied in bunches from rafters, packed into jars with beeswax seals hidden from damp and rats. They used vinegar as a preservative, honey as medicine. Honey healed wounds faster than many modern salves, it's naturally antibacterial. Knights carried it into battle. Monks smeared it on burns. Children licked it for sore throats. Sweetness as salvation. Of course, not every healer survived their success. When crops failed or plague returned, someone had to blame. The same hands that once offered cures could be accused of curses. Yet quietly, stubbornly, the knowledge endured. And today, when we brew chamomile for sleep or dab aloe on a burn, we echo their survival wisdom, softened, sanitized, but still alive. So as you rise, brushing dirt from your knees, you feel a strange gratitude. For the nameless healers, the herbalists in the shadows, the monks in their gardens, all those who kept the thread of knowledge unbroken. Because survival wasn't only about strength of body, it was about curiosity, faith, and the courage to learn from the earth itself. Shelter from wind and war, see how stone, mud, and even dung became armor against weather and raiders alike. The herbs, the fire, the bread, each one was survival drawn from the land. But now, as twilight deepens and your path winds closer to the edges of the medieval world, you begin to see that nature gave something else too: tools, shelters, and cunning ways to bend the landscape itself. Tonight, you'll learn how people built, mended, and outsmarted the wilderness, all without metal nails, electricity, or Google searches. The air smells of peat smoke and damp timber. Ahead, a cottage crouches low under its thatched roof as though afraid of the wind. You duck inside. The walls are woven literally. They're made from branches, packed with clay and straw. It's called wattle and daub, a method that sounds quaint but was a masterpiece of efficiency. It kept heat in, wind out, and could be repaired with a handful of mud. You touch the wall. It's cool, slightly rough, almost alive. Builders mixed horse dung into the clay for binding strength, a detail best not mentioned at dinner. The roof above you is thick thatch, layered reed by reed, steep enough for rain to roll off instead of soaking through. When built right, thatch could last 50 years. Modern roofs envy that. Outside, someone chops wood. The rhythm is steady, almost meditative. Medieval people didn't waste a single chip. Green wood for bending, seasoned wood for burning. Hazel for baskets, oak for beams, willow for fish traps. Every species had a purpose, a secret known by heart. You wander down toward a stream, where a man kneels beside a small wooden contraption. 2 buckets swing from a stick balanced on his shoulder, a yoke. It's simple but brilliant. With it, he can carry more water than his hands ever could. This was the pattern of medieval invention. Humble, handmade, astonishingly effective. Nearby, someone's shaping iron at a forge. Sparks scatter, bright against the twilight. The blacksmith is one of the most vital people in any village. Every hinge, plow, horseshoe, and pot hook begins in this glow. He works not for glory but survival, because without him, nothing moves, grows, or gets repaired. But blacksmithing was only one craft. The weaver, the cooper, the potter, each held ancient tricks to stretch limited resources. Potters recycled broken shards into new clay. Weavers unraveled old tunics to reuse the yarn. A frugal genius ran through the age, born not of choice but necessity. You cross a muddy yard toward a low hut. Inside, smoke curls from a clay oven, a kiln of sorts. It's warm, quiet. Here, a woman shapes bowls with her hands. The clay came from a riverbank, dug and left to weather in frost until soft. She'll bake the pieces over open flame, hardening them into stone. Historians still argue whether such small craftwork counted as art or survival. In truth, it was both. And then there were tools, the silent saviors. The sickle for cutting grain, the flail for threshing it, the quern for grinding it to flour. The knife you carry at your belt is your lifeline, your all-purpose companion. It skins, cuts, carves, repairs. You might lose your cloak or your boots, but never your knife. Some tools were clever beyond belief. A fire steel, just a shard of carbon steel and flint, made flame in seconds. A beetle, basically a giant wooden hammer, could split logs or crush hemp for rope. The spinning wheel, though not widely used until later centuries, transformed thread-making forever. Before it, women spun with drop spindles, their fingers constantly moving as they walked, talked, or even prayed. Water was power too. Before the steam engine, before electricity, there were mills. You hear the creak of one now, a watermill on the stream. The wooden wheel turns, each paddle scooping the current's strength. Inside, giant stones grind grain day and night. It's hypnotic, rhythmic, eternal. These mills were the heartbeat of medieval survival. Without them, entire villages would starve. Even shelter could be mobile. Shepherds carried collapsible huts into the hills, woven of sticks and wool felt. Nomadic herders in Central Asia, the ancestors of the yurt dwellers, used techniques that spread westward over time. A circular tent that could be packed on horseback, yet survive mountain winds. You could live a whole life in one. Back in your village, repairs never stopped. Leather boots were patched until they became more stitched than skin. Iron pots were mended with rivets. A broken door wasn't thrown away, it was reforged, repurposed, reborn. The idea of waste didn't exist. If you couldn't fix it, you melted it down. Night falls, the last light glows on the thatched roofs, and you notice how the houses huddle close together. That too is survival, heat shared through proximity. In deep winter, animals might even sleep indoors, goats and chickens adding their warmth to the families. It sounds strange until you feel the cold clawing through your cloak, then it feels like genius. You step outside again, the stars swimming in a velvet sky. Somewhere nearby, a distant howl of wolves drifts on the wind. Your mind goes to defenses, not castles or walls, but everyday cleverness. Hanging bells on the edges of fields to scare animals. Smearing ash on the ground to keep pests from crawling into food stores. One farmer ties strips of linen between posts so they flap in the breeze, the earliest scarecrow. Another hangs fish bones near his granary door, claiming it deters spirits. Maybe it deters rats instead. Either way, it works. Historians still debate whether medieval builders understood engineering as we do today. Yet cathedrals still stand, timber barns still rise, and watermills still hum. Whatever you call it, luck, instinct, or craft, it worked for centuries. You kneel and run your fingers over the packed earth floor. It's hard, smooth, and cool. People mix straw and ash into dirt to make it firm, a natural concrete. When it cracked, they simply re-smoothed it. Even the poorest hut held the quiet ingenuity of its builders. The smell of the fire creeps back, pine resin, wood smoke, warm bread. Somewhere inside this world, people found beauty in function. They made things not to impress, but to last. And maybe that's what we've forgotten, that survival isn't always about progress. Sometimes it's about patience. Your eyes grow heavy, the mill wheel keeps turning. The thatch creaks softly in the wind. Somewhere the blacksmith's forge still glows red in the dark, an ember of human persistence, flickering against the impossible night. The art of staying clean-ish. Find out how people kept infection at bay without soap, toothpaste, or hand sanitizer. You step away from the glowing forge and thatched huts, moving into the quieter corners of the village, where survival took a slightly different form. Here, cleanliness wasn't optional, it was subtle, strategic, and often counterintuitive. In the medieval mind, staying clean could save your life, even without soap, toothpaste, or running water. Tonight, you trace the rhythms of staying clean-ish in a world that seems impossibly dirty to modern eyes. The first clue is water itself. Villagers used it sparingly, not just because it was precious, but because they understood the danger of standing pools. A quick rinse in a river might do more than remove mud, it could remove lice or other small infestations, but scrubbing constantly, wasteful. The full bath was rare, instead, people favored targeted cleaning. Face, hands, and feet received attention. Other areas were left alone, both for warmth and modesty. You kneel beside a basin in a simple wooden home, peering at the water. Hot stones might have been dropped into it to warm it, a trick still used in some parts of the world today. A pinch of ash or sand added mild abrasiveness, pre-industrial exfoliation, enough to scrub hands clean for work in the fields or kitchen. Modern soaps hadn't arrived yet, but ash acted as alkali, mildly effective against germs. And then there were herbal washes. Mint, rosemary, and sage were crushed into water for bathing or hand-washing. Their antiseptic properties weren't fully understood, but they worked. Vinegar was another favorite, used as a disinfectant and deodorizer. Imagine dabbing vinegar under your arms instead of deodorant, crude, pungent, yet practical. Medieval towns were often crowded, full of animals and people in close quarters. Lice, fleas, and other pests thrived. To combat them, villagers brushed hair with combs made from bone or wood, sometimes rubbing it with vinegar or oil to deter insects. Some families even hung bundles of dried herbs near sleeping areas, not just for scent but as a pest repellent. You can picture the faint aroma of lavender, thyme, and rue drifting through the small rooms, a soft barrier against the constant intrusion of bugs. Public latrines and privies were designed with logic even if hygiene was primitive. Shared pits were cleaned whenever possible, and running water was introduced in wealthier towns to carry waste away. In rural areas, people learned to locate wells and latrines strategically to avoid contaminating their drinking water. It was simple, practical, and deadly effective if observed carefully. Historians still argue whether medieval towns had a real understanding of disease transmission or just noticed patterns and acted on instinct. Laundry was another ritual. Clothes were seldom washed with soap. Instead, they were beaten, boiled, or exposed to the sun. Sunlight itself acted as a disinfectant, while beating fabric removed grime. Stripes of linen were often rotated through multiple uses before being replaced. Imagine layering clothing strategically, so the outer layer could protect inner layers from soil, sweat, and muck. Strategy mattered more than fragrance. Even the food preparation areas had rules. Herbs were used to mask odors, yes, but also to reduce spoilage. Garlic and sage again played double roles, seasoning and sanitation. Smoke from kitchen fires helped sterilize tools and storage rooms. Flour, stored in tightly woven sacks and often kept above the damp earth, rarely went completely bad. The mothball equivalent, charcoal or dried herbs tucked inside sacks to repel insects. And don't forget teeth. Few people had brushes, but they chewed twigs or rubbed them with ashes or salt to clean teeth. You can imagine the taste, gritty, smoky, sometimes bitter, yet it worked better than nothing. Monks sometimes chewed aromatic sticks as they prayed, both for oral hygiene and fresh breath during long services. Even rituals played a role in cleanliness. Bathing festivals, communal washes, or ritual ablutions combined hygiene with social and religious practice. You can see why these activities persisted for centuries, especially before centralized plumbing. Cleanliness was survival and spirituality intertwined. You glance toward the edge of the village where animals are kept close. Goats, chickens, and pigs are part of daily life and part of the hygiene challenge. You notice a simple but clever trick. Raised sleeping platforms for humans keep them above the animals' pens. Waste falls below, bedding stays relatively dry, and the risk of disease decreases. It's not perfect, but it's ingenious. Some remedies verge on the quirky. Fleas might be discouraged by sprinkling certain herbs in beds. Smoke from herbs burned at night also repelled pests. People didn't know about bacteria, but they understood cause and effect. Certain actions kept discomfort and disease at bay. You wash your hands again in a basin of warm water, feeling the grit of ash and herbs under your fingers. It's crude, yes, but functional. The medieval world didn't require perfection. It required observation, adaptation, and subtlety, a daily negotiation with dirt, disease, and necessity. And as you stand and shake the water from your hands, you realize that hygiene wasn't vanity. It was another layer of survival, as important as fire, cloak, water, and bread. In a world teeming with danger, keeping yourself clean enough might just mean the difference between life and death. Signals in the smoke trace the subtle codes of bells, torches, and smoke plumes that kept villages alive through chaos. Night deepens, and the village is quiet except for the occasional cluck of chickens or the distant bray of a donkey. You move cautiously now, aware that medieval survival didn't end with water, food, or hygiene. No, it also demanded understanding the animals around you, both friend and foe. Tonight, you step into the world of medieval livestock, pests, and wild creatures that could provide sustenance, companionship, and sometimes trouble. You enter a barn, the smell of hay and manure rising warmly into the chilly air. A cow shifts in her stall, shaking her head, her breath fogging in the cold. Livestock were lifelines, cows for milk, ploughing and meat, sheep for wool, pigs for fat, chickens for eggs. Each animal required attention, knowledge, and timing. A missed milking, a sick lamb, or a wandering pig could tip survival toward disaster. You kneel to inspect the straw. Fleas, lice, and mites abound, but medieval people had tricks. Ash, herbs, and vinegar sprinkled on bedding helped reduce infestations. Some barns even had low-smoke fires burning medicinal herbs to deter pests. Smells you might find unpleasant were essential to the household economy. Then there were the predators, wolves, foxes, and stray dogs. Shepherds carried long staffs, small bells, and sometimes spears to protect flocks. One clever method was the guardian goose, trained to hiss and attack intruders. Imagine a flock of geese, feathers bristled, chasing away a fox. It sounds comical now, but it saved livelihoods. Historians still argue whether geese were used widely or mostly symbolically in records, but the stories persist. Hunting was another essential skill. Villagers had to understand animal behavior, tracking patterns and seasonal cycles. Deer were hunted with bows, traps, and sometimes dogs, rabbits with snares, fish with nets, weirs, and hooks. Survival required patience and timing. You crouch beside a stream, imagining someone centuries ago crafting a simple fish trap of woven reeds, patiently waiting as water and instinct do the work. And then there were pests of a different sort, rodents. Rats were everywhere, carriers of plague and disease. Granaries were elevated or lined with smooth clay to prevent them from climbing. Cats were more than pets, they were indispensable hunters. You spot one curled on a windowsill, tail flicking. Its presence alone could save a family from losing a winter's grain. The symbiosis between humans and animals was intricate. Goats were milked multiple times a day, but also provided hair for cordage. Chickens scratched for bugs in the yard, fertilizing the soil. Horses worked the land, but their manure nourished it. Nothing was wasted. You pick up a handful of straw and notice flecks of dried manure, a reminder that life and death, cleanliness and filth, often shared the same space. Some survival techniques were delightfully clever. People used dogs not only for hunting, but as early alarm systems. Roosters, as predictable as sunrise, became natural timekeepers and sometimes even warded off small predators. A well-trained animal could save a flock, a child, or even an entire household. You pause at the edge of a field. A fox slinks in the shadows, eyes glinting. You remember the advice of a 14th century farmer: respect the fox but don't feed it. Predators were to be managed, not eliminated, because they kept the ecosystem balanced. Too many rabbits and you lose crops, too many foxes and the hens vanish. Survival meant understanding every moving piece in the environment. And birds weren't just prey, they were companions. Some medieval peasants trained pigeons for messages, while others observed migratory patterns to predict weather and planting times. Nature itself was both warning system and pantry. Even in the dead of winter, the rhythm of animal care continued. Feeding, bedding, milking, and cleaning occupied the entire day. There was no vacation from survival. Sick animals meant no milk, no wool, no eggs, and that could quickly cascade into human sickness. You can imagine kneeling in the snow, coaxing a weak lamb to drink from your hands, praying quietly for both of you to endure. Then there were the quirky practices that make you smile. Some farmers carried pieces of iron or charms in the barns to keep spirits, or perhaps rodents, away. Others sprinkled water from the morning dew around coops, believing it brought fertility and protection. You'd scoff today, but maybe it works psychologically, keeping farmers vigilant, alert, and engaged with their animals. The day winds down and you leave the barn. The animals settle, the faint smell of hay and manure lingers, comforting in its consistency. You realize that survival in this world wasn't just about you. It was about networks of life, the cow that fed you, the dog that protected you, the cat that kept pests away, the fox that balanced the land. Every creature had a role, and ignoring that could be fatal. You take a deep breath. In a world without supermarkets or veterinarians, understanding animals, domestic and wild, was as crucial as knowing fire, bread, water, and herbs. Because survival wasn't just skills. It was observation, respect, and a kind of quiet communication with every living thing around you. Animals as early warning systems meet the birds, dogs, and even rats that medieval folk relied on to sense disaster before it struck. The night has grown still, almost eerily so. You step away from barns, streams, and hearths, and now your attention turns to movement, observation, and awareness, the subtle skills that could keep you alive when the world outside the village grew hostile. In medieval survival, knowing the land and how to move through it safely was just as crucial as food, water, and warmth. You tread softly along a woodland path, branches snapping underfoot, and imagine yourself as a traveler or soldier centuries ago. Every footfall must be deliberate. Footprints could betray you, broken twigs could give away your position. Hunters, scouts, and even thieves relied on silence as a form of armor. Historians still argue whether medieval soldiers were truly stealthy in the forests, or if tales of shadowy knights and wandering scouts are romantic exaggerations. But the principle remains: careful movement saved lives. Trees weren't just scenery, they were tools and markers. A seasoned wanderer could read the forest like a map. Moss on the north side of trees, trails subtly worn by deer, and patterns of fallen branches all offered guidance. Even the wind's direction and scent of damp earth told stories about weather and approaching danger. You inhale deeply. The air is rich with life and subtle warnings. Pathfinding was a skill taught early. Children would walk alongside parents, learning landmarks, star positions, and river shapes. Forget GPS. Survival relied on memory, observation, and instinct honed over years. A misstep could leave you lost for days, exposed to cold, starvation, or wild animals. Nighttime required different strategies. The moon, clouds, and stars became critical. Even when clouds hid the sky, travelers used the sound of water, rustling leaves, or animal calls to navigate. Some medieval guides recommended listening to the song of birds at dusk or dawn, as each species had predictable patterns and directions. You pause and strain your ears, and you swear you hear the faint rustle of an owl, somewhere just beyond the undergrowth. Then there were defensive movements. Crossing open fields was dangerous. Bandits, hostile villagers, or even wandering soldiers might be lurking. Travelers learned to zigzag paths, approach settlements at predictable times, and always maintain the option to retreat. Signals were primitive but effective. A knocked stone could indicate a safe path. A tied knot in a branch might warn of danger. Subtlety was essential. You come upon a small hill, overlooking a stretch of forest and field. In medieval terms, this is a perfect lookout point. From here you can see movement in the distance, note smoke from distant fires, and judge the flow of water. Scouts relied on elevation like this to protect villages, warn travelers, and plan for raids or storms. It's a reminder that survival isn't passive, it's active observation, constant vigilance. For travelers, equipment enhanced these skills. Simple things like sticks for balance, small mirrors to catch sunlight signals, and even bells for communication across distances made journeys safer. Sometimes a simple staff could be both walking aid and weapon. Clever, adaptable tools were as important as clothing or food. Animals again played a role. Dogs could alert to danger or help track game. Horses, for those who could afford them, allowed faster movement, though they required fodder, water, and shelter. Birds were occasionally trained to carry messages or signal alarms. The natural world became both guide and guardian. Night camouflage wasn't sophisticated, but it existed. Dark clothing, cloaks, and even mud were used to blend into the landscape. Travelers learned to walk along shadows, avoid open moonlight, and use the forest's natural barriers for cover. Every step was a calculated negotiation with visibility. You pause and visualize the past. A lone pilgrim making his way through forests, a small bag of bread at his waist, a flask of water, a wooden staff in hand, cloaked against the cold. One misjudged step, one careless glance, and survival could slip away. Yet with knowledge, observation, and respect for the land, humans endured. And it isn't just about hiding. It's also about noticing opportunity. A berry bush in bloom, a safe creek crossing, a hollow log offering shelter. These were gifts to the aware. Ignoring them could be fatal. Embracing them could sustain life. By the time you descend the hill, you realize that movement and observation are invisible weapons. They are quiet, subtle, and often overlooked in modern thinking, yet they were essential for anyone navigating medieval Europe. Every careful step, every watchful glance, every note of animal behavior was part of a survival rhythm passed down through generations. Because survival isn't just about strength or tools. Sometimes it's about patience, attentiveness, and blending yourself into the rhythm of the world around you. Faith, fear, and the mind's survival end with the most vital weapon of all, belief itself, and how faith, ritual, and superstition kept people sane and sometimes alive. You move from forests and hills back toward the faint glow of the village, feeling the weight of everything you've learned: fire, water, bread, herbs, animals, hygiene, movement, observation. But survival in the medieval world demanded one more thing: community, cunning, and negotiation with the human world itself. Alone, even the most skilled traveler might fail. Together, people survived centuries. The village is quiet now, torches guttering in the wind. You notice subtle signs of cooperation everywhere: doors reinforced with wood strips, neighbors' barns clustered close enough to share warmth, pathways cleared communally through mud and snow. Medieval survival depended on watching others, helping, and being helped in return. Sometimes a handshake or a shared loaf of bread meant the difference between life and death. You approach a small hearth where 3 villagers are huddled. One sharp-eyed woman inspects the day's catch from the stream. Another, a wiry man, mends a torn cloak. The third child listens, absorbing every motion. Here, survival is taught informally through observation and example. Stories, songs, and advice are passed down orally. Instructions are short, memorable: do not wander after dark, protect your water, share your fire. These maxims carry centuries of collective wisdom. Barter is everywhere. Coins are scarce. Often, survival relied on negotiation. A chicken here, a loaf of bread there, a coil of rope traded for a wool blanket. Everyone knows the value of practical skill. A blacksmith or weaver has leverage, sometimes more than a lord. You remember the old saying whispered in villages: give what you can, take what you must. It's a delicate balance. Yet humans are unpredictable. There's always risk: theft, envy, feuds. You glance at a fenced yard where 2 men argue over livestock. Weapons aren't drawn lightly, but reputation and intimidation serve as defense. You realize that in a society without law enforcement, survival required diplomacy almost as much as fire or knife. Travelers, pilgrims, and merchants had their own rituals for safety. They carried talismans, wore distinctive clothing to signal alliances, or traveled in groups large enough to deter bandits. Even mundane habits like marking trails or sharing news at crossroads became essential survival techniques. Every small action had consequences. And superstition weaves through everything. Saints, relics, holy water, charms against evil, and prayers weren't just religious, they were psychological shields. People believed they protected their bodies, families, and fortunes. Modern science might scoff, but in the medieval world, belief was survival. Confidence, courage, and faith often determined whether someone endured hunger, disease, or attack. You notice a child feeding a stray dog from a crust of bread. Animals weren't only functional, they were companions. Loyalty, trust, and affection kept people resilient. Pets were part of survival networks, offering protection, warmth, and emotional support in a harsh, unpredictable world. Fire circles back into your thoughts. Even in communal spaces, fire was central. It heated homes, cooked meals, and illuminated paths. Social life revolved around it. Villagers shared stories, news, and advice around flames, passing lessons to those who might one day walk alone in forests, fields, or hills. Survival knowledge moved through human networks as much as through written manuscripts or hands-on skill. And now you understand the unspoken rule. Survival isn't just a series of tricks, it's a lifestyle. Awareness, preparation, adaptation, and cooperation intersect. Each decision, each observation, each shared resource builds resilience. People lived, thrived, or failed in cycles dictated by seasons, weather, disease, and human behavior. Mastering the environment was half the battle. Mastering the people around you was the other half. You pause at the village gate, looking back at the softly lit homes, the quiet streets, the smoke rising from chimneys. You've walked through centuries of survival without leaving your spot in time. The skills seem alien, yet practical. Every element: food, water, hygiene, shelter, movement, observation, animals, medicine, and community, forms a thread in a tapestry of enduring wisdom. And as you breathe the crisp night air, you realize that medieval survival was not just about enduring hardships. It was about learning to read life itself, to anticipate, adapt, and navigate both nature and humanity. Perfumed beginnings of Egypt. You glide through ancient Egypt, where beauty meant divinity itself: kohl-lined eyes, crushed gemstones, and a bit of crocodile dung to stay radiant under the sun. The Egyptians believed that beauty was more than skin deep. It was sacred, a bridge between mortal and divine. You can almost feel the fine grit of crushed minerals under your fingers as you grind malachite and galena into a rich, black paste. Historians still argue whether kohl was mostly cosmetic or primarily medicinal, intended to protect against eye infections caused by the harsh sun and Nile dust. You smear a line across your eyelids and immediately feel sharper, more alert, more godlike. And there's that quirky tidbit. To protect the skin from the punishing rays, some used a concoction of crocodile dung and animal fat as a sunscreen. Yeah, you probably won't survive the smell, but ancient texts boast its surprisingly effective SPF, and there's the line between ewer and ingenious that keeps you walking barefoot through these markets in awe. You wander past vendors selling scented oils, myrrh, frankincense, lotus, and notice the subtle layering, a dab on the wrists, a smudge behind the ears, a hint on the neck. Perfumes were wealth, status, and the ultimate flirting tool. Men carried them as carefully as swords, and queens perfumed themselves as a sign of regal authority. You probably wouldn't have guessed it, but some Egyptians also mixed honey with red ochre to tint their lips, a sticky, slightly crunchy stain that somehow makes them glow under the desert sun. Even their teeth weren't spared from beautification. Chewing on twigs from aromatic trees was both hygiene and cosmetic, keeping breath pleasant for conversations with pharaohs or neighbors alike. Step into a courtyard shaded by palm fronds and imagine the daily spa rituals. Baths infused with lotus petals, the faint hum of harp music, attendants gently scrubbing sand and sweat away with linen cloths. You notice that nails were painted using mixtures of henna and carmine, the red streaks symbolizing fertility and vitality, and sometimes even status. There's a curious historical debate on whether these rituals were widespread among the common people or largely confined to nobility, but the presence of cosmetic artifacts in worker tombs hints that even those without palaces indulged, albeit sparingly, in small touches of personal artistry. You crouch beside a shallow basin, dipping your fingers in scented oil, and realize that every motion, every smear and dab is steeped in intention, blending beauty with spirituality, practicality with aesthetics. Around the corner you stumble on a festival scene, dancers swirling with gold leaf bracelets clinking, faces shimmering under coal and ochre. The air is perfumed, sticky with honey and incense, and somewhere a baby's laughter pierces the soft drone of the Nile. You probably won't survive without being overwhelmed by the sensory overload, but in this world beauty isn't just cosmetic, it's lived, inhaled, experienced. And that little absurdity, the crocodile dung sunscreen, is a reminder that in ancient Egypt, necessity often masqueraded as glamour. You move toward the riverbank, watch the reflection of the sunset paint everything gold, and realize that beauty rituals here weren't vanity. They were survival, devotion, and an art form rolled into one. Mesopotamian glow beneath ziggurats and clay tablets. You uncover how early urban women brewed lip tints from crushed berries and oils, believing beauty could summon favor from gods and kings alike. You trudge across the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where mud brick walls rise like slow breaths from the earth, and the ziggurats loom above like stone prayers reaching for the sky. The air smells faintly of baked clay, barley, and the sweet musk of pressed oils. Here, beauty is not just sacred, it's political. You probably won't survive the intensity of social expectation without at least learning a few tips from the local women, who wield pigments and potions like wands, shaping their appearances as carefully as scribes inscribe cuneiform tablets. So before you adjust your tunic and take that first hesitant step into a market bustling with merchants, take a deep breath and imagine yourself among them. Perfumes here are thick, layered, and made from exotic resins imported along dusty trade routes. You dip your fingers into a small clay jar filled with crushed berries and oils, noticing how the scent clings to your skin. Historians still argue whether these cosmetic practices were for divine favor, personal allure, or both, but the evidence in tombs and palace frescoes suggests that the line between the sacred and the sensual was intentionally blurry. Women in Mesopotamia cultivated their beauty like gardens. Lip tints were crafted from ground madder root or beet juice, a hint of rouge that could denote status, health, and even fertility. You probably won't survive the stickiness of the paste without laughing at yourself as it dries unevenly on your fingers, yet it leaves a lasting impression on anyone who glimpses it. Eyeliner, derived from soot or galena, is rubbed around the eyes not only to protect from glaring sunlight, but also to evoke the gaze of deities, wide and compelling. Imagine a priestess staring from her temple balcony, eyes dark and elongated, watching over the city, her beauty a conduit of divine oversight. As you wander through a bustling courtyard, you notice small boxes of perfumed clay and tiny pots of scented oils. They are meticulously arranged like treasures, waiting to be applied during dawn rituals or evening gatherings. The air shimmers with hints of cinnamon, cedar, and frankincense, mingling with the bread baking nearby. You smear a little paste on your cheeks, remembering that some Mesopotamians also experimented with crushed gemstones for shimmer, a practice so eccentric that it seems more like a flirtation with alchemy than mere vanity. Quirky, yes, but somehow utterly effective at catching the light during public ceremonies. In the midst of this sensory explosion, you stumble upon an artisan blending oils with rare flowers, chanting softly to ensure the mixture is spiritually potent. Some argue that the ritualized preparation mattered as much as the application, that the act itself imbued the wearer with divine protection or favor. You probably won't survive without marveling at how beauty here intersects with the mystical, a far cry from today's Instagram filters. Then there's hair, long, dark, and sometimes elaborately braided. It's scented with fragrant oils and occasionally dusted with ground minerals to enhance shine. Historians still debate whether these powdered hair treatments were widely used or reserved for ceremonial purposes, but the effect is unmistakable, a glimmering, almost otherworldly appearance that commands attention in markets, temples, and palace halls alike. As you brush your fingers through the strands, you notice traces of the berry-tinted lip paste still clinging to your skin, a subtle reminder that beauty, like culture, is a living, breathing thing here, shared between gods and mortals, commoners and kings. Step into a quiet courtyard near the river. Women crouch, mixing oils with incense smoke curling around them. Some dab the paste on their eyelids, others gently massage fragrant oils into their hands. You probably won't survive without feeling a little envious of their meticulous care, how each ritual, however small, is woven into the very fabric of daily life. The soft lapping of the Euphrates mirrors the gentle movements of their hands, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that lingers long after you've stepped away. Even the common folk play with beauty, though in simpler ways. Smearing clay masks to cleanse the skin, biting gently into berries for lip stains, or tying aromatic leaves into hair to mask the heat of the sun. Quirky, practical, and utterly charming, these practices reveal a civilization deeply invested in aesthetics as part of survival, identity, and divine connection. You probably won't survive the realization that these small rituals, repeated across centuries, have echoes in our modern creams, dyes, and perfumes, proof that human fascination with appearance is, in some ways, eternal. As the sun dips toward the horizon, casting long shadows across mud-brick lanes, you pause to watch a procession of women adorned in oils and pigments. Their movements are fluid, ceremonial, and yet intimate, a private beauty made public. Some smear honey on their hands, not for flavor, but for the subtle sheen it brings. Others layer crushed berries over clay masks, a blend of utility and artistry that blurs the lines between cosmetic and ritual. Historians still argue whether such elaborate care was primarily for public display or deeply personal satisfaction, but the effect is undeniable. Beauty here is a statement, a shield, and a bridge to something larger than oneself. Greek gods and olive oil. You wander marble courtyards where athletes and maidens slather olive oil on their skin, mixing vanity with philosophy in a society that worships symmetry and scent. You step onto sun-baked marble of an ancient Greek courtyard, the heat warming the stone under your bare feet, and immediately feel the echo of a civilization obsessed with balance, proportion, and the kind of beauty that whispers of gods walking among mortals. You probably won't survive without noticing that nearly everyone, men and women alike, is slicked in olive oil, their skin gleaming like a freshly polished amphora in the morning light. So before you sink into the rhythm of the agora, take a moment to breathe in the subtle aroma of pressed olives mingling with the faint tang of sea spray, and imagine yourself slipping through the same rituals that athletes and philosophers once did. Greek beauty was a philosophical pursuit as much as a physical one. Every gesture, every contour, every smear of oil had a purpose. You rub a little oil between your palms, remembering that the gymnasiums, where men trained, wrestled, and competed, were also salons of sorts. Olive oil wasn't just decoration. It protected skin from the harsh sun, softened muscles after exercise, and even acted as a mild antiseptic for minor scrapes. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of olive oil was more about practical care or the cultivation of a visually idealized human form, but standing here, with sunlight bouncing off the marble, it feels inseparable from aesthetics. As you wander past colonnades and fountains, notice the subtle art of hair and fragrance. Women dressed in flowing chitons braid their hair with meticulous precision, often weaving fragrant herbs like rosemary or thyme into the strands. You probably won't survive without marveling at the lengths they go to, and yet there's a playful eccentricity too. Some Greeks powdered their hair with crushed seeds or even ashes to achieve the coveted pale sheen that distinguished noblewomen from servants. It's quirky, almost theatrical, but effective in asserting social hierarchy with subtlety. Step closer to a bustling bathhouse where men and women mix exercise with cleansing. Strigils scrape oil and sweat from skin, leaving a glossy glow, and attendants whisper gossip or philosophy depending on the hour. You dab your fingers in honey-infused cream, an ancient exfoliant, and feel it stick slightly before melting into your skin. The combination of tactile sensation and scent feels luxurious, bordering on indulgence, and you probably won't survive the sensory richness without pausing to admire the thoughtfulness of these routines. Beauty is tactile, aromatic, and deliberate. Beyond cosmetics, the Greeks embraced a diet intertwined with aesthetics. Olives, figs, and wine weren't just nourishment, they were extensions of personal presentation. Athletes believed that certain foods enhanced skin tone, muscle definition, and even hair luster. Quirky experiments included rubbing crushed herbs into the scalp to stimulate hair growth, a practice that modern scholars often debate for efficacy, but undeniably shows a dedication to appearance that's methodical and scientific. Imagine walking through a crowded agora where philosophers lecture as potters and weavers sell wares. The contrast is stunning, intellect, artistry, and vanity intertwining seamlessly. Women carry small alabaster bottles of perfumed oils, dabbing wrists and temples, while men polish themselves with scented ointments before public discourse or civic ceremonies. You probably won't survive without feeling the subtle thrill that beauty here is both performance and devotion. Some Greeks even took teeth whitening seriously, using crushed pumice and wine to maintain dazzling smiles. You cringe slightly at the abrasiveness, but admit that in a society obsessed with symmetry, every detail matters. Historians still argue whether such routines were widespread or limited to urban elites, but their presence in medical texts and cosmetic treatises hints at a culture that codified beauty almost as rigorously as philosophy. As you meander along the Aegean coast, the smell of salt and oil blending with crushed herbs and the faint smoke of cooking fires, you notice a child attempting to mimic the motions of their mother, gently massaging oil into the skin, arranging hair, smearing berry tints on lips. You probably won't survive the sweetness of this moment, witnessing how beauty is passed down, observed, and performed from a young age. The blend of practical skincare, fragrance, and ritual elevates daily life into art. Finally, you pause on a sunlit terrace, watching the water ripple as maidens apply rosewater to their cheeks and athletes polish their skin for upcoming competitions. The interplay of sunlight, oil, and movement creates a living fresco. Some scholars still debate whether the Greeks emphasized beauty for gods, neighbors, or self-reflection, but standing here you feel it's all of the above. Beauty is philosophy, ritual, and personal expression, a reflection of inner and outer harmony, and a reminder that even thousands of years ago, humans were both meticulous and delightfully eccentric in their quest for radiance. Roman baths and beeswax secrets, you drift through steaming thermae where Romans exfoliate with pumice, bleach their hair with vinegar, and whisper gossip over honey masks. You step through the grand arches of a Roman bathhouse, the air thick with steam and the faint tang of olive oil, herbs, and heated stone. The warmth presses against your skin, and you probably won't survive without taking a moment to inhale deeply, letting the scents of honey, lavender, and resin mingle in a dizzying tapestry that feels almost sacred. So before you sink onto a marble bench and let the gentle drip of condensation run along your forearm, picture the steady rhythm of bathers moving through pools, saunas, and scraping stations, each gesture studying care, vanity, and ritualized relaxation. Romans treated beauty as a public spectacle and a personal necessity. You drag your fingers across the warm surface of a pumice stone, remembering that exfoliation here is practically mandatory. Smooth, radiant skin is as much about social standing as health. You probably won't survive a day without noticing the judgmental glances exchanged across steaming pools. Historians still argue whether the luxurious bathing routines were primarily about hygiene or civic display, but the evidence is clear. The baths are arenas where status, cleanliness, and beauty converge. Hair is next. Romans often lightened theirs with vinegar, sun, or even lye treatments, striving for that golden shine admired by poets and matrons alike. Quirky but true, some women also dusted their hair with ground beets or ashes to achieve temporary color effects. You probably won't survive without marveling at the creativity, and yes, occasionally the smell of these experimental dyes. Beeswax was another staple, not just for hair styling, but as a base for scented pastes applied to the skin. Picture a matron smoothing warm beeswax over her face, gently embedding rose oil, a subtle shimmer catching the light of flickering oil lamps. Walking past the frigidarium, you notice attendants mixing honey with ground nuts into masks, applying the paste with precision. Honey, they believed, softened wrinkles, prevented infection, and even acted as a subtle fragrance. You smear a bit onto your wrist and almost immediately feel the stickiness, a tactile reminder of how Roman cosmetics blended utility with indulgence. Quirky, practical, and occasionally messy, these concoctions are evidence that beauty is not always painless, but deeply satisfying. Perfumes float through the air, some derived from imported spices, others from local herbs steeped for days. You dab a tiny amount behind your ears and feel almost ceremonial. Romans infused oils with amber, myrrh, and even rare resins, carrying small bottles everywhere. Historians still argue whether daily scenting was a personal preference, or if it was a social necessity, signaling refinement and wealth. Either way, the effect is undeniable. The air is perfumed, skin glows, and every gesture feels deliberate, curated, and socially charged. Makeup in Rome is surprisingly versatile. White lead powders for the face, cinnabar for lips, and kohl for eyes echo trends from Egypt, but with a distinctly Roman flair, bold, theatrical, and public. You probably won't survive the subtle hazards, lead aside, but the artistry is undeniable. There's a fringe tidbit too. Some women occasionally added crushed gemstones to face powder for a faint sparkle under candlelight. It's extravagant, impractical, but utterly mesmerizing. As you meander past the caldarium, imagine bathers massaging scented oils into their limbs, scrubbing skin with strigils, and gossiping about gladiators and senators. The bathhouse is both sanctuary and stage. You probably won't survive the intimacy of it all without feeling slightly voyeuristic. This is civilization at its most sensorial. Every surface warm, every scent curated, every gesture meaningful. Even the teeth weren't neglected. Romans chewed sticks dipped in charcoal or powdered pumice for polishing. Historians still debate the frequency and efficacy of such routines, but ancient texts are clear that a gleaming smile was considered essential for social encounters. You dip a finger into a honey mixture, imagining it doubling as a facial mask and subtle sweetener, and the sensory layering, the scent, texture, and stickiness, reminds you that beauty is a full-body experience here, not a quick brush or swipe. Finally, you step into an open terrace overlooking the city, watching reflections dance across the water in the frigidarium below. Roman baths are alive with ritual, indulgence, and a hint of performance. Men flexing muscles, women adjusting hair, attendants dabbing oils and powders in choreographed precision. You probably won't survive without noticing the artistry, the intentionality, the sheer devotion to appearance that defines this culture. And as you inhale the last hints of myrrh and beeswax, it's impossible not to realize Rome didn't just bathe. It curated, celebrated, and almost worshipped beauty in motion. Indian alchemy of beauty, you sit among ancient Ayurvedic scholars blending turmeric, sandalwood, and rosewater. Each touch meant not for seduction, but for spiritual purity and cosmic harmony. You step into a courtyard of an ancient Indian city, the air fragrant with sandalwood smoke, turmeric, and crushed rose petals. The warm stone floor radiates heat beneath your feet, and you probably won't survive without pausing to inhale deeply, letting the scents weave into your senses like a soft, perfumed fog. So before you trace your fingers over the intricate designs of carved pillars and step closer to the alchemy of beauty itself, imagine scholars and artisans blending powders, pastes, and oils in a ritual that's as much spiritual as it is aesthetic. Ayurveda, the science of life, permeates every movement here. You watch as women carefully measure turmeric, sandalwood, and rosewater into a smooth paste, which is then gently massaged into the skin to enhance complexion, purify, and balance inner energies. Historians still argue whether these rituals were primarily health-focused or meant to enhance attractiveness, but standing among these fragrant clouds, it's clear that the two were inseparable. You probably won't survive without noticing how each motion, rubbing, blending, patting, is imbued with intention, a gentle choreography of care passed down through generations. Hair treatments are no less meticulous. You witness thick, dark tresses being coated in amla and bringraj oils, then gently combed and sometimes adorned with jasmine blossoms. Quirky but true, some women even added a pinch of gold dust to their hair for ceremonial occasions, a delicate shimmer that caught sunlight and lamp glow alike. You probably won't survive the glittering effect without feeling momentarily divine, imagining yourself as part of a courtly procession or a temple ritual. Face masks here are a sensory wonderland. Multicolored clays and ground herbs are blended with ghee or honey to create textures ranging from creamy to grainy. Some believe the paste detoxifies the skin, while others argue it draws in spiritual energy, purifying both body and mind. Quirky tidbit, powdered pearls occasionally made their way into these masks, lending a luminous sheen that seems almost magical. You probably won't survive the sensation, the coolness, the faint stickiness, the fragrance of crushed rose and sandalwood, but it's intoxicating in its complexity. Perfumes are layered meticulously. You watch as artisans distill rose, jasmine, and vetiver oils, blending them with subtle spices like cardamom or saffron. Each scent is applied strategically, behind the ears, along the collarbone, or even on the hairline, ensuring a presence that's both intimate and enveloping. Historians still debate whether fragrance served primarily ritualistic purposes or acted as social signaling, but as you dab a drop on your wrist, you realize its power transcends logic, existing as a bridge between inner state and outward expression. You move through a ceremonial garden where women crush fresh flowers into pastes for cheeks, lips, and hair. Each petal is carefully chosen, each stroke deliberate. Some even use tiny wooden spatulas to layer pigments in thin, precise lines, a laborious but meditative practice. You probably won't survive the visual elegance without noting how beauty here is an exercise in patience, almost a meditation, where tactile sensation and aroma intertwine with cultural symbolism. Even nails are not neglected. Henna, applied in intricate patterns on hands and feet, serves both aesthetic and spiritual purposes, symbolizing joy, health, and social standing. Quirky historical note: in certain regions, henna was combined with turmeric or indigo for special occasions, creating hues and patterns that modern enthusiasts might envy. You probably won't survive without trying to trace the delicate swirls with your eyes, imagining the ceremony of drying, perfuming, and finally revealing them in sunlight. Diet plays a subtle but crucial role. Ghee, milk, and aromatic herbs are believed to support skin and hair health from the inside out. Some ancient texts recommend sipping herbal decoctions while applying oils externally, a dual approach to wellness and beauty. Historians still argue over the effectiveness of these internal remedies, but the logic is elegant. Beauty is holistic, inseparable from health, mood, and environment. You probably won't survive noticing how every small ritual, every mixture of powder or oil, has layers of purpose: practical, aesthetic, and spiritual. Stepping closer to a temple courtyard, you see a final layer of care: jewelry and adornment. Gold, pearls, and semi-precious stones are applied not just for shine, but as an extension of the rituals themselves, enhancing the visual poetry of skin, hair, and scent. Quirky but delightful. Some women even shape small symbols with clay or paste on their foreheads or cheeks as temporary embellishments, merging art and identity. You probably won't survive without marveling at the precision, the layering, and the sensual choreography of these ancient beauty acts. As the sun dips low, casting golden light over carved pillars and perfumed gardens, you step back and realize that in ancient India, beauty is alchemy, a mixture of ritual, sensory indulgence, and spiritual alignment. Every stroke, every scent, every pigment tells a story of devotion, care, and cultural continuity, a tradition that hums softly through the centuries, still echoing in modern skincare and ritual. Chinese silks and secret powders. You stroll through perfumed pavilions where pale faces gleam with rice powder, jade rollers cool the skin, and herbal infusions promise eternal youth. You glide along a jade-lined corridor of an imperial Chinese palace, the soft rustle of silk echoing beneath your feet, and immediately sense that beauty here is an exercise in subtlety, discipline, and quiet power. You probably won't survive without noticing how every movement, every touch of powder, and every fragrance is orchestrated to communicate status, elegance, and refinement. So before you linger over carved screens and lacquered furniture, inhale the delicate aroma of plum blossoms, sandalwood, and crushed herbs, letting the scents swirl around you like a gentle breeze from the imperial gardens. Pale skin is paramount. Women meticulously apply layers of rice powder, achieving a soft, ethereal glow that signifies nobility, leisure, and inner virtue. Historians still argue whether the obsession with whitened faces was purely aesthetic or socially coercive, but standing here, you can't ignore the almost magical transformation that occurs with each delicate swipe. Quirky tidbit: some women mixed rice powder with small amounts of lead, a dangerous practice for that perfect, long-lasting whiteness, proving that vanity sometimes outweighs caution. You probably won't survive the realization without wincing at the risk, yet marveling at the ingenuity. Hair is equally ritualized. Long, jet-black tresses are combed until they gleam, sometimes treated with herbal oils to maintain luster. Occasionally, jade or ivory hairpins are tucked in, not merely decorative, but as symbols of rank and refinement. You probably won't survive without noticing the patience and precision required to achieve such an effect, imagining attendants gently massaging oils into each strand as soft music hums in the background. Perfumes and scented powders are layered with similar care. Delicate sachets of jasmine, sandalwood, and osmanthus are placed within garments, while subtle fragrant powders brush against exposed skin. These scents are social signals as much as indulgence, a soft yet unmistakable aura that sets nobles apart from servants. Historians still debate whether scent was more important than visual appearance, but standing amidst the swirl of aromas, it's clear that fragrance completes the aesthetic tapestry. Cosmetic artistry extends beyond face and hair. Fingernails are carefully manicured and often coated with crushed flowers or plant pigments, a visual statement of refinement and hygiene. Some even applied cinnabar for a gentle red hue, a color that harmonizes with lips and garments. You probably won't survive the intricate attention to these small details without feeling a sense of awe at how seriously beauty was integrated into daily ritual. Clothing, texture, and color amplify the effect. Silks dyed in soft pastels or jewel tones drape over pale skin, and embroidered patterns subtly echo the motifs of hairpins, powders, and nail colors. Quirky but true, occasional use of ground pearls mixed into silk fibers added a soft shimmer that caught sunlight in private chambers, a secret sparkle visible only to the wearer and closest confidants. You probably won't survive without smiling at this little luxury, imagining the quiet delight of secret embellishment. Face creams and masks blend practicality with ritual. Ground herbs, rice bran, and pearl dust are applied to nourish skin, often in slow, meditative sequences. Some masks are left overnight under silk veils, others brushed lightly before stepping into daylight. Historians still argue about the efficacy of these ancient formulas, but the devotion to preparation and application suggests that the process mattered as much as the result. You probably won't survive noticing the tactile elegance, the gentle patting, the faint fragrance, the almost imperceptible cooling sensation. Daily routines include more than cosmetics. Tea ceremonies, meditative exercises, and slow, deliberate movements all contribute to posture, expression, and aura. Beauty is inseparable from comportment, a holistic discipline linking mind, body, and appearance. Quirky tidbit: some women practice gentle facial massage with jade rollers, a tradition that has survived into modern skincare, proving that ancient rituals can endure centuries. You probably won't survive the thought that a simple stone could become a centuries-long obsession, yet here it is. Even the eyes receive attention beyond makeup. Subtle eyeliner or shadow from crushed minerals enhances their shape, while eyebrow plucking and careful shaping frame expressions meant to communicate restraint, intelligence, and serenity. Historians still debate how much these practices were standardized versus individualized, but the meticulous care is undeniable, a blend of artistry, status, and personal identity.